Hey everyone, so I've decided to post a little bit on this channel to discuss about some of the sort of philosophical, political, world type topics, the challenges in our world and thoughts and ideas that I have about things that might or might not work. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about a subject that I find super interesting, which is the subject of post-democracy. So I find this really frustrating thing with people, and this was exemplified on Twitter today. I had made a comment that I figured democracy was unable to solve the problems that it has created. And somebody said, well, if democracy, if not what? And I commonly hear this refrain. For example, there's an expression from Winston Churchill, which is, democracy is the worst system we've got aside from all the others. And I think the problem with that attitude is it becomes the end point when it should be the beginning point. So you could have just as easily said that with monarchy before that, or with whatever other previous system. You could have said, hey, well, if not Confucianism, what else are we going to have, etc. And so to me, I'm always interested in the innovation and what are we going to get to beyond what we've got today. I think it's just clearly obvious that the way we progress is we invent new things, we learn from it, and then we come up with something later. And we shouldn't be looking back for systems that work, we should be looking forward for systems that work. So it's kind of obvious to me that democracy as they've got it, in particular I would say in the US, was relatively effective for the time that it was in. I think it served a useful place for a useful period of time. And to me it's amply clear that that is not the case anymore. And this is exemplified really by two main things. So the first thesis I have for why democracy can't solve the problems that it's created is exemplified by the percentage of government spending responsible for GDP. And to give you a little bit of an idea of how this works, just consider you have a voter base, right? And that voter base, if they're in a position where too many of them rely on government spending, they're never going to vote to cut government spending, right? So this is super important. Another thing that happens, unfortunately, with democracy is democracy tends to work fairly well when you have a pretty even wealth distribution. It tends to work very poorly when you have a large wealth distribution, meaning you've got a large gap between rich and poor, excessive amounts of wealth at the top and at the bottom. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Democracy, in its purest form, has a certain element of tyranny of the majority. Of course, we can define and ask, well, what is democracy? Obviously, there's lots of different forms. There's representative democracy, there's constitutional democracy. You can have, various different forms of being a republic and so on and so forth. And frankly, I think what's good about something like the US system is a lot less to do with the democratic process and a lot more to do with the checks and balances on government. That being said, when you're in a situation that you have the majority able to essentially vote to confiscate wealth from a small number of people, you just naturally have an incentive that this is going to happen. I think you see it to some extent in a more accelerated form in Europe, but I think you can see it in general, where there is the larger percent of the population who, just imagine this, if everybody is more or less in the middle, right, or there's a large distribution in the middle, then what you're going to find is that voting to raise taxes hurts people about as much as it helps them, right? If you have a high concentration of wealth at the top and a high concentration at the bottom, the majority of voters are going to be more helped than hurt by, at least in their perception, by voting to tax the rich at extremely high rates, confiscatory rates, right? And some people might say, oh, well, back in the day, there used to be these really high tax rates in the US, you had 80%, et cetera. The interesting thing is that the percentage of tax revenue to GDP more or less has not changed. You're more or less around 20%. It didn't matter whether you go back to when taxes are high or taxes are low, you tend to collect the same amount. Now, if you look at this situation where we have growing wealth inequality, and I think the growing wealth inequality, from my perspective, is an almost intractable problem. I think it is highly, highly, highly likely that it is going to continue to be a growing problem. I'll probably discuss that in a future video or something. But from my perspective, if you're betting on increasing wealth inequality, you're probably betting in the right direction. We haven't hit a point yet where that really reverses in the world, from what I can say. And of course, you can narrow down in that and say, well, okay, well, in what country? And are you talking between countries? Are you talking within countries? And within what groups of people, and there's lots of nuance to that conversation. But I think in general, we're going to continue to see this. And the main reason is essentially due to scale dynamics of the world today. Essentially, the payoffs of being right in one form or another, whether being right is being right from luck or being right from skill, are exponentially higher than they were historically. You just have a situation where somebody can, you look at, for example, the lottery, right? You can have like billion-dollar lotteries today, insane, right? You can have just this enormous payoff through virality. The celebrity effect has grown really dramatically because you can reach a much larger audience. The same is true of starting a business when you have software and so on and so forth. So because of this, I think you're naturally going to continue to get this greater wealth divide that comes in. And there are some ways that we can probably reverse that, and some things will probably change eventually, but for the foreseeable couple decades, I expect it to get worse. And democracy doesn't cope very well with that dynamic. Furthermore, democracy really doesn't cope well when you have this distorted incentive system that so many people are reliant on government spending. They're never going to vote to decrease government spending. They're going to vote to increase government spending, right? So to give you some stats, the most efficient countries, so if you were to look at countries around the world based on percentage of government spending to GDP, you will find there are two that have really low numbers that actually are good countries. So in other words, there's some countries that you wouldn't want to live there, right? Very bad. Then there's some countries that do well, and I think those are the ones that are worth focusing on to see how they distribute. And these two are Taiwan and Singapore. They're about 15 and 16% respectively. Pretty reasonable number probably. If you look at someplace like UAE, you're talking about 25%. If you're looking at someplace like Switzerland, you're talking about 33%. The US is now at like 42%. And the highest ones, France, Italy, Greece, are around 60%, okay? So when 60% of your GDP comes from government spending, you're incentivized as voters to increase government spending. It's really, really hard to cut government spending in that environment. And you might say, okay, well, in some countries, we've had, these strong, centrally planned communist regimes. Well, we know how those have turned out, right? Central planning tends not to work that well. It just tends not to be very competitive. So in my model of the world, competitiveness is just a really, really important characteristic of any society or civilization, etc. And so if we want to say, well, let's get a system to work better, we need to somehow reverse that course. And I just don't see that democracy is capable of doing that. That's the first reason why I think there's a problem with democracy. The second thing that I think is fundamentally a problem with democracy is that in a high-scale, high-complexity world, and one of my base theses is that the main challenge facing our world today is the explosion of scale and complexity. The quality of decision-making, either by a representative or by your average voter, goes down. So there's a famous Winston Churchill line, which is the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with your average voter. And that's probably true, although most people don't like to consider that they're the average voter. And if you just think, okay, I'm going to get a representative in there, well, the way that we have it set up right now, what you'll notice is that as complexity increases, inherently the ability of the decision maker to make good decisions across that complexity decrease. So the relative expertise or skill level of whoever the decision maker is going down. And there's supposed to be this kind of wisdom of the crowds thing that comes into play, which is essentially what happens with markets. And so kind of there's a democracy theory behind that. To give you some idea, one of the ways they kind of tested this was they would ask experts the weight of a cow, and these experts would guess, and then they asked a mass of people, I think it was around 2,000 people, and they averaged theirs, and the average tended to converge on something that was reasonable. And the reason for this is because the extremes tend to cancel each other out, and you converge on something in the middle. I think that is true when you have a simple decision to make, right? So people's intuition for the weight of a cow can be relatively within a reasonable boundary. But if you ask somebody to formulate a theory for dark energy, well, that's a totally different conversation, right? The ability of the average person to do that is going to be extremely, extremely low. And we just have more and more things in our society that are high complexity. We're living in these complex systems, and you have to make decisions based on those complex systems. So even if I look at how people understand money or banking or taxation or a lot of these things, their degree of understanding is just really low. And I just don't believe that you're typically going to be in a situation where the quality of decision making of voters, when you have a mass of voters like that, is going to be very high. And if we have kind of increasingly low quality of decisions from the voter base, that's a bit of an issue, right? In addition to this, I think that somebody might make the argument, well, hang on a minute, but what about this cancellation effect, etc. So if you look at where this works, it doesn't tend to work. So that effect that I mentioned breaks down when you have media. It tends to be the loudest voice tends to tilt the audience in one direction or another, which actually decreases the quality of the voting. That being said, probably the wisest voices and the smartest voices often aren't the loudest voices. That creates some degree of problem in there. Hopefully you have, a degree to which kind of those voices can get picked up and they can get rebroadcast and things like that. That's kind of like a hopeful story. I'm a little skeptical that happens. But more importantly, I think what you can see is in markets, because you might say, well, market is a complex system and, doesn't pricing work out pretty well in markets? Well, one of the differences in markets is that you're rewarded for deciding right? So if I make the right decision, then I get rewarded with profit. And what that means is that the weighting of my decision gets to go up because I have more money. Essentially, the voting is not even across the whole population, right? Some people have many more votes than others. And it turns out the people who have many more votes, as a general rule, are those who tend to make better decisions. That's why they have more votes. And if it turns out they make bad decisions, then they lose their number of votes. And so you have this constant rebalancing effect that takes place. And I think you can get into some nuances of, okay, like where does that break down and stuff like that. That's a reason for another video. But my point is, from my perspective, the quality of decision making that you're getting from a democratic process is not very good. And increasingly, that's more and more important because we live in a more and more complex system. So I'm very interested in the topic of post-democracy. Like, what would be the thing that comes after that if we kind of envision some different approach? I mean, you can look at post-nation states. I think that's also interesting. So post-nation states, post-democracy, post-capitalism, these are kind of all three similar areas that I find quite fascinating. And it's not exactly clear what these answers would be, but people can postulate some theories. So for example, I think there's an interesting idea of having participatory democracy. What would this look like? Well, essentially that if you want to get a vote or you want to get a higher weighted vote, then you have to participate in the process of educating yourself around that topic. And there's different ways that you could do this. For example, various different parties could present different views and they could essentially debate it out, and you would be required to, basically go through some education process on that, participate in some dialogues back and forth, view both sides, etc. And based on the amount that you'd engaged yourself in there, you would get a higher vote. That would be one idea, right? Is that, the best idea? Who knows? But it's an interesting thing to include that you couldn't really historically do, but today with things like easy video tracking, right? I can log into a website, I can watch a video, we can track all of that, and a computer can score and basically say, okay, here's the number of, the amount of time, the amount of investment, the demonstration of knowledge, etc., that you've got, and therefore off you go. And you could ask, well, can't you game that system? There's probably ways to game it, and so you have to kind of build some game theory around that. And I'm not presenting like a complete theory of it. Over the course of maybe several videos, I'll talk more about it, but this is an idea that I think is interesting. Another one would be that somehow you have some sort of expertise, right? You demonstrate competence and you kind of rise through a process by which you get an increasing amount of weighted voting. And so in general, I think weighted voting is kind of an interesting idea. Another thing would be that when you're electing people, you're not electing representatives to represent you across all spectrums. So in other words, does it make sense that one person represents you in tax, infrastructure, crime and punishment, defense, healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Probably not. It probably makes sense that you would pick somebody who's an expert on healthcare to represent you in health, and an expert on education and an expert on defense. It would make sense that you would get experts from across these different fields to represent you. So that's an interesting idea. Probably there's something to be said for implementing more transparency about what's actually going on, about having some sort of grading system to see, based on implementing this, what actually happened, and having a bit more of like a bit more like what would happen in a company, right? Hey, here's our plan, here's our metrics, are we hitting the metrics, etc. That sort of decision making might be helpful, right? There's probably some sort of different incentive structure that could be brought in. So one idea might be that if they're able to save the government a whole bunch of money, then they get rewarded a lot for it. That's another thing that you could consider. You can consider trying to boil things down a lot smaller and then having kind of interlocking, overlapping different systems of decision making through something like DAOs. So there's lots of different theories that one could come up with that might present one direction or another. And it's not really clear what those are at this point in time. I'm just interested in exploring it because I think there's obvious deficiencies. And I think when I reason it through from first principles, I ask, all right, what is the key concept behind governance? Is who makes decisions? How do they make decisions? What do they make decisions about? And what are the objectives around those things, right? So we have some sort of a target. We have to decide, okay, what are we going for here? What are we optimizing for? And then there's going to be some sort of a person making some sort of decision-making process about some sort of particular area. I guess we could ask around that, how is it measured and incentivized, right? So maybe that's 5 different areas of examining. And right now, I think the incentives are absolutely terrible within government. I think that it's not clear that the people who are making decisions are particularly smart or wise about it. It's not clear to me that the decision-making process is particularly good. They're making decisions about areas that they don't really have, and I don't really see that a lot of them have that much in the way of goals or targets to go for. So this whole process, as far as I'm concerned, seems to be just really, really poor. And you might say, you could make an argument that part of the idea is to remove a lot of central decision-making, right? Governments should do less. I'm pretty sympathetic to that view. There's a lot of arguments that many of the areas that government touches are handled poorly. I don't think it's good to throw them all out. I don't believe that the kind of libertarian extreme view is sensible, because I think fundamentally we have to coordinate in some ways. We have to be in a situation where we are able to resolve differences. We can, join pool resources for common stuff, and so you've got all sorts of areas there. This being said, if you just straight down you think, okay, well, probably the people who have made good decisions in the past about this are probably going to be people who are more likely to make good decisions in the future about it. And so probably it makes sense that you would have people do small experiments. They would play a role at a small scale, and then somehow you would scale up. China does a bit of this, right? We know generally that competition tends to breed performance, right? That if you could compete with other people who are kind of doing similar things, etc., this has a rising effect in it. And so maybe that's something, right? You have much more of a funneling up than we have today. Interesting idea. If it would, in particular, be based on some sort of merit, right? You have to achieve better results than, some cadre. So again, in the Chinese example, you've got like 30 different, provinces or regions. The people compete within there. And you kind of filter down, there's 10 different areas within those and 10 different cities within those, and so you have this kind of filtering out process that happens. So, you've got an interesting incentive structure there. I think clearly you would want those people to be able to become quite wealthy from it. This is something that seems antithetical today, but I think if you want people not to be bribed by special interests, which seems to me readily apparent that it's happening today, then you have to compensate them on the other side. Which means if you do a great job for the country, if you save the country $100 million, why shouldn't you make $1 million? You save the country $100 billion, why shouldn't you, get compensated $1 billion? Like, you should be able to get rich by doing good for your country. If you can't do that, it seems very, very weird to me. But that's not a very popular view today. So anyway, I'm gonna leave it at that for now, but I wanted to kind of explore this idea and put out that over the next while, I'm gonna talk a bit about post-democracy. I'm also going to talk about post-capitalism and post-nation states, because I think all those are part of the broad change that's going to take place. It will not be quick, right? These are changes that will probably take place over the next few hundred years, but I do think they're important.